What follows is footage related to the 100th birthday of Edward Thompson. There are short extracts of moments from the event itself, held in Halifax on the 3rd of February to mark Thompson's 100th birthday. There are also long-form films of contributions by particular figures who were involved on the day, talking about trade union education and talking about their work and various projects to try and organise and stimulate a working-class educational movement and network.
I'm John Dunn. I originate from Claycross. I was a Derbyshire miner for a lot of my working life. And the thing about Thompson that has occurred to me or reoccurred to me today is I attended Derbyshire NUM's day release. And the first book we were told we had to read, not should read, had to read, was The Making of the English Working Class, which, I mean, as long as it is, it's captivating. And today's talks have made me want to revisit it. And I think it's even more relevant today when people now are in isolated front workplace. The whole issue of a post-industrial society, how do we deal with that? And a lot of political education has not addressed that.
What a wonder it is to see so many people here. Isn't this splendid? Edward Palmer Thompson obviously lived in Halifax for 17 years, 1948 to 1965. During that time and far beyond, he did some astounding things. I'm not going to say much about them because I'm sure the speakers are going to talk about those. He produced some amazing work and a legacy that perhaps isn't as well recognised and acknowledged today as it ought to be. It's the hope of the people who've organised this event that one of the things that will come out of this is a broader recognition of that and perhaps some work that we can do together to acknowledge E.P. Thompson's significance and to bring it back into the public realm, to make it alive again today in the context of intellectual work and political work that certainly needs doing.
I was still at school when The Making of the English Working Class was published. Although I was studying for A-level history and had an excellent teacher, was more up to date than most. For instance, he introduced us to the work of George Roudet. No mention was making mention of Edward Thompson. For this, I had to wait for my first year at Essex University. And here my initial encounter was not with The Making, as it's come to be called, but with two other of Edward's works. The Peculiarities of the English, published in the Socialist Register in 1965, and the seminal article, History from Below, published in a special issue of the Times Literary Supplement in April 1966, headed New Ways in History. Both were a revelation. The first because it offered an interpretation of 18th century English history which made sense to me. The second because it championed an approach to history quite different from that of the prevailing orthodoxy. In 1969, Edward encouraged me to apply for the MA in Labour History, offered by the recently established Centre for the Study of Social History, of which he was the director. It was here I encountered Edward as a teacher. As a lecturer, he was superb. But what I remember most was his ability to prompt his students to explore new sources and to ask new questions. And secondly, the postgraduate seminars he ran and often chaired. These seminars featured a wide range of speakers.
In 1970, Thompson was teaching at the University of Warwick. Students had been pressing at that time in 1970, had been pressing for a proper student union building under their control, as in most universities. But the university's building committee, stuffed like their council with businessmen, had other priorities. After an initial sit-in at the registry, students were threatened with legal action. And so on the 11th of February, a second sit-in took place. A senior official who was concerned about the well-being of his staff agreed to evacuate them from the building and to leave all the office doors unlocked. And many of the filing cabinets. That evening, someone began to look at some files in an office and found a report of surveillance of a visiting professor, David Montgomery, who had been invited over by Edward the previous year. He was being spied upon at a talk he had given to Chrysler workers on the GM sit-down strike of, 1936, was it, I believe?
I'm here really because I've just been awarded a PhD in Women and Chartism at Leeds University at the age of 60, which perhaps proves the spirit of adult education that E.P. Thompson pioneered and championed is still alive and well. So I want to start by talking about the making of the English working class, because just under 60 years ago, an obscure historian from the University of Leeds delivered a manuscript which was overdue and over length to Victor Gallant's The Making of the English Working Class. It wasn't really destined to be a top seller. Thompson was never a conventional historian. He worked, as we've heard, in adult education. He was an active communist and then an active peace campaigner, somebody committed to putting his politics into practice. And it wasn't his first book. In 1955, he'd written his book about William Morris, which had met the fate of many academic books and sunk like a stone. So nobody could really have imagined the success of the making of the English working class, which became a runaway commercial and critical success.
I'll just start by saying a little bit about us for those that haven't come across us before. We're a federation of 28 trade unions with an affiliated membership of just over 600,000 members. We carry out a range of campaigning and organising work alongside our affiliated unions and the broader trade union movement, but with a particular focus on educational work. We run quite a broad range of trade union and working class education. And one of our key aims is to move beyond the kind of narrow functionalism that we think has infected a lot of trade union education, and to reinsert an understanding of labour history, of political economy, and of political education in its broadest sense into trade union and working class education. And I like to think that that's something that E.P. Thompson would have very much approved of. I want to thank Calderdale Trades Union Council and the other organisers of today for the invitation to speak. Unlike many of the contributors today, I didn't know E.P. Thompson personally. I was 13 years old when he died, and I never had the opportunity to meet him. Nevertheless, he has, via his best-known work, The Making of the English Working Class, had a significant influence on me as a trade unionist. And in my contribution, what I would like to do is identify three interlinked themes that I draw out in my reading of that book that really influence, I think, the way we need to respond as a trade union movement to the issues and the crisis that we face today. And there's no doubt that it is a crisis when we look at the attacks on the trade union movement, on the organised working class, when we look at the devastation of our public services, of our wages in work, of our communities. There's no doubt that we need all the lessons we can get in how we respond as a class.
I'm the editor of this publication, Post 16 Educator, and I'm the author of this pamphlet about the Plebs League. Speaking as a supporter of the Independent Working Class Education Network, the first recorded use of the phrase independent working class education was by the South Wales mine worker and Checkway man Noah Ablett in 1907 at a meeting in Oxford. Ablett and others went on to build the IWCE movement. The IWCEN, we now, are trying to build a modern equivalent to that movement. I want to pose the question, what did Thompson's job involve? E.P. Thompson basically taught, as people here know, classes in English and history across Yorkshire from 1948 to 1965. He did that typically on 4 evenings a week, or sometimes 5 or more evenings, 2-hour classes, all in the evening from September to April each year. And the places where he taught these classes were, and I apologise if I mispronounce one of these, Leeds, Ossett, Bingley, Shepley, Harrogate, Morley, Todmorden, Middlesbrough, Keighley, Northallerton, Hemsworth, Broughton, and especially Batley, Cleckheaton and Halifax. He said this about his 1953 class in Batley. It contained 2 doctors, housewives, a textile worker, a printer, a painter, a sawmill manager, a rag, wool and waste merchant, a post office engineer, a clerical worker and a head teacher. Now, looking across the evidence about the people that were his students in that time, I think that was a reasonably typical kind of composition. He began drafting a book about Morris in 1950. Why Morris? He was looking, I think, for the highest status English Marxist intellectual about whom he could write a book. I think that's basically what it was. And the original version of his 900-page plus book, biography, was published by the Communist Party publisher Lawrence and Wishart in 1955 under the title William Morris, Romantic to Revolutionary. So I want to pose the question, what was Morris's influence on Thompson? Among the things, the kind of thing that Morris did was he always tried to connect with workers' own good sense. His talks were always centred on patient persuasion using reasoned argument. He always stayed close to concrete realities. He always used an informal approach. The talks were always fairly short and meticulously prepared. He always used plain language, and he always recognised the need to keep ideas and actions linked, and he always recognised the role, above all, of working class agency.
I was suddenly, and from a very inexperienced position, in charge, basically, of CND's international work. And of course, I was of great interest to people who realised how important that was. Is it going to oppose Western weapons and Soviet weapons? Thatcher and Reagan axis, which was pretty scary at the time. There was what Jill Liddington mentions in her book, I think it's in The Long Road to Greenham, that suddenly all over the Western world, people were waking up, literally waking up in the morning, having had horrible nightmares about their children and themselves being turned to cinders by a nuclear war. And they wanted to do something. So peace movements sprang up everywhere in the Western world. And Edward, you can see from, this is just a quote from the END appeal, had what I think, looking back, is a genius idea of stating the terms right from the beginning. Edward is the one with the poetic vision. There was poetic vision in the END appeal, which grabbed people, but there was political vision. And the political vision was that we should, in fact, oppose the nuclear weapons of East and West.
Would Edward Thompson be thrilled at a gathering like this today? Undoubtedly. I knew Edward and Dorothy in what turned out to be the last 25 years of Edward's life, and he often talked to me of his happy days in Halifax, when he not only taught but learned. But at the same time, Edward was not of the era of the lovey-dovey school of meetings and seminars. Would he be arguing, if he were here, with me, with all of you, with Dan? I'm sure there'd be some fault in the circular. Yes, he certainly would. And I want to make 3 points about Edward and his vision of the world under 3 headings: passion, perseverance, and power.
Dave Chappell, I was a militant shop steward in the Royal Mail for most of the 38 years I was a walking postman. Down in Somerset, and did overtime in Bristol. And in retirement, I organised trade union councils. Why I'm here, because you can read about E.P. Thompson, is this was organised not by a university, but by a local trade union council in Calderdale. So for me, it was an act of solidarity. The universities have abandoned extramural education, doesn't exist. The workers' education doesn't exist. In the 1970s, I went to both, and that helped me, for example, get a steer and get information about syndicalism, the British syndicalist movement, which still inspires me as a militant shop steward, although I'm retired. But the trade union movement is alive, and as long as the trade union movement is alive, it has the possibility of an intellectual wing which deserves to be maintained and revived, and I'm into that.
I want to start. There are many, many things to be said about Edward Thompson, and of course Dorothy, his companion for many years, who we shouldn't forget, a very independent-minded person in her own right. Let's start with the decision in 1956, after the invasion of Hungary, by an extremely misguided Soviet Union. A large number of Communist Party intellectuals, young, middle-aged and old, left the party. He and others set up a magazine called The New Reasoner, in which was effectively the magazine of people leaving the Communist Party. It offered them space. I just picked up at random, literally, the summer 1959 issue. The lead article is Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, on the New Left. And there's so much of it which is still apposite. I begin with the opening sentence from Edward, his editorial called The New Left, quoting from William Blake. And William Blake, the quote from William Blake was written in 1810. "I'm really sorry to see my countrymen trouble themselves about politics," wrote William Blake. "House of Commons and Houses of Lords appear to me to be fools. They seem to me to be something else beside human life." Now, Blake, of course, could be very sharp, and Edward admired that sharpness, and then pointed out that this was Blake being angry, because on the next page of his notebook, he was denouncing the wretched state of political science, which is the science of sciences. But that anger and apathy towards these institutions of the British state, of course, exists today as we gather here to mark Edward's the centenary. I mean, these millions of people, young and old, who've been marching up and down the streets of Britain on Gaza and calling for what? For a ceasefire, that's all, are being rejected, denounced, reduced, pressure put on them by the government and by the opposition, because Starmer is expelling a lot of Jewish members of the Labour Party who don't happen to agree with Netanyahu. So I was seriously reading this morning. I thought, how many of these young folk who've been on the demonstrations, and many of us older folk too, will vote for the Labour Party, which is a question Edward raises in this first piece. Again, it depends, I guess, on which constituency. I mean, my own position was decided by the fact that I'm in a very unfortunate location, because my member of parliament actually is Keir Starmer, which makes the decision very easy for me. But you know, I think other people will have problems. Friend and comrade, especially in his last years, I do still miss him a lot, and often something happens and you wonder what would Edward have thought of it. And of course, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he would have been horrified by what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Horrified, because almost unbelievable, as many people are, Jewish and non-Jewish, in parts of the world, at what is going on. So on that somber note, I'll say thanks and very nice to be with you.
My name's Michael McGowan. For 15 years, I was the Labour member of the European Parliament representing Leeds. I met Edward Thompson at a friend's house in Robert Town in the Spen Valley. I got to know him well when I was unemployed, started doing work with European nuclear disarmament. He was a brilliant researcher. He a good speaker. My mother used to say she hated history because it was all about kings, queens and wars. Well, it was for so many people, but unless you study history, you don't understand what is the position to hear. And he was so keen on doing his classes in the pubs and clubs of the West Riding of Yorkshire, particularly this area.
So this is my copy of The Making. It's like yours probably. And it's when I was in sixth form doing my A-levels, my history teacher had this always at his right hand, and he called it the Bible. And I've seen people sort of holding their copies here, so it feels almost kind of reverential that we're in some sort of Methodist service reading the Bible. So I'm a historian, I'm an academic, and I've been invited just to talk about where we go next as a historian. So I'm not really going to talk about politics in the kind of specific sense, but where history has come from since the making, and where we can see traces of Thompson's influence in history writing today. And we've been quite depressed today, I think, about the state of higher education, rightly so. Also the state of further education and adult education. I am quite excited about the work that Gawain and others have presented in terms of the role that trade unions can revitalise in that. But the current state of academic history is parlous. I'm at the University of Hertfordshire, used to be Hatfield Poly. We're struggling really with humanities. And it's also, although there is a lot of enthusiasm for the humanities amongst young people today, and I can see some young faces in front of me. I'm not the youngest person here in the room, although sometimes it feels like it. We've got to look to the future really to work out what, in 50 years' time, we're in here, who are we going to be celebrating behind us when all of us have gone? But then after Edward's passing, we moved into an era of post-colonial and feminist critiques which picked holes at the making and his other works, and picked on particularly his themes about Anglo-Saxon liberty and the freeborn Englishman, which were crucial to Thompson's work on the 1790s to the 1830s, because that was the language in which the working class was speaking. And it jarred somewhat with unfolding arguments about colonial oppression and global inequality and gender inequality as well. And the transatlantic swing to the right in the 1980s displaced those once dominant Marxist interpretations of the economy. Sociology departments were quite often stripped of personnel because of the kind of right-wing move in sociology and economics, although quite a few of those sociologists found refuge in geography departments. I'll talk about geography later. But what really seemed to hit the nail on the head within academic study was post-structuralism in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which certainly in the histories of 19th century British popular politics rejected most of the things, overtly rejected most of the things that Thompson and his contemporaries had been writing about. And with their focus on identity politics, language politics, they were looking for no class struggle without any class. In some respects, they rejected the determinism of economic structures and the sense of really important movements for working class history, labour history, such as the Chartists, were. It was an interesting kind of oxymoron that they were the focus of the post-structuralists' study in order to denigrate them, or in order to demonetize them in some senses. Generally, if you are a labour or social historian in universities now, particularly if you're doing British history, you are in the minority. So when I came into the academic profession, there was a kind of circle of us who were quite interested in rural protest, and actually the influence at that time was less the making of the English working class, which is essentially about industrial workers, and it was more thinking about Hobsbawm and Roudet's Captain Swing and the rural unrest of the early 1830s.